Hi, this is Caroline Holland, and my final experiment is going to be about parental and maternal roles during stressful situations for infants. So both of the research articles that I looked at were by the same researcher DeCasper. So the first existing one that I did was about maternal speech and its influence on newborns' perception of speech sounds. So the question was, will newborns prefer acoustic properties of a particular speech passage, known as the target story in this experiment, if their mothers repeated the passage while they were pregnant? The researchers were wondering if there was evidence that prenatal auditory experience with a particular maternally generated speech stimulus would influence the reinforcing value of that stimulus post-birth. So in other words, if a baby listened to the mother read a story while she was pregnant with them, would they then post-birth, one, be able to recognize the story, and two, would it be more reinforcing if they heard it from their mother's voice versus another female? So the independent variable was the babies who heard their mothers reading the target story, and the dependent variable were the sucking burst of the baby. So babies sucked on a pressure transducer, and if they were sucking above their median, it showed that they were being reinforced. So the dependent variables for the target story were their reinforcement ratios. And in the experimental group, they had infants hear a tape of the mother reciting the target story. And again, the target story is the story that the mother read while she was pregnant, and a tape recording of another woman's voice. This experiment found that babies were more reinforced when they were listening to their own mother's voice when the mom recited the passage that she read while she was pregnant. And this is important because it shows that, yes, babies are listening to their mothers because we know that they have auditory functioning starting during the last trimester. And so that's why a mother's voice may be reinforcing post-birth. So I thought that this was very interesting that they actually could prefer their mother's voice because they could hear them while they were in the womb. The second study that I looked into that inspired me to pick this topic focused more specifically on the male voice. And so it was human newborns' perception of male voices and if they had a reinforcement value, such as the mother's, since we just learned that from the previous study. So the infants wore earphones, and they sucked on a non-nutritive nipple that had a pressure transducer, such as the first experiment. So the independent variable was if a father was reading it or another male, and the dependent variable was the sucking pressure or rate. So if they were sucking more than the median sucking rate, that meant that they were being reinforced. And we wanted to see if it made a difference if it was their father's voice or another male, because this would show that the father's voice could also be a kind of reinforcement. So even though the father didn't read to them or do anything while they were in the womb, this is just post-birth, it just was kind of to see the role that the father's voice can play. Unfortunately for the males, results demonstrated that a father's voice was actually not reinforcing, and it had the exact same sucking rates as just a normal male voice. So the infants did not seem to preference the father's voice over a male's voice, which was interesting. So for this experiment, I want to have 10 female infants, 10 male infants, all around 8 months old, and then an additional 5 infants mixed up with gender, of course, also 8-month-old as a control group. So then that will be a total of 25 infants participating in the study, but for the experimental group, it will be a sample of 20 infants. And mix up the genders based on assignment to hearing the mother's voice or the father's voice, because I don't want there to be any kind of a gender bias. So a mix up of 10 different experiments of infants. Have a stranger come in the room, and then those 10 will hear a mother's voice overhead, and then a separate group of 10 will have a stranger come in just the same way as the mothers did. However, the only difference is then they will hear the father's voice overhead. And then with the 5 control group that I mentioned earlier, they will only have the stranger coming towards them without any voice overhead. So the independent variable is going to be whether or not a stranger is in the room, because the stranger comes in the room for the mother's voice playing overhead and the father's voice playing overhead, just not the control group. And then also whose voice is playing overhead, if it's the mother's voice or the father's voice. And then the dependent variable, I want to test heart rate of the infant. If they have a rapid heart rate and it gets really high and then they become distressed and crying, that would be something to note on if they were discomforted or scared. And then if their heart rate was lower and they were not showing emotional signs of distress, that would be a positive thing to show that something is working. So the dependent variable is going to be heart rate and emotional signals of distress. So how is the actual experiment going to be work, and what is being tested and what happens? So I'm kind of copying what the strange situation did. So ethically, I can't do anything that actually is dangerous for the infant. But in this scenario, we want the infant to feel a little bit frightened, a little bit discomforted. And so having just a stranger, like another experimenter, come in the room, it's not actual danger, but it may make the infant feel, if they're alone in a room and then a stranger comes in, it may make them feel like they are in danger. So that's kind of why I put that there, because I kind of want to copy that experiment. So we're going to have an infant on the ground just playing. We're going to have a stranger come near, and then as the stranger walks in, we're going to test the heart rate of the infant. Once the baby sees the stranger, we're going to have, either depending on the group that they're in, the mother's voice or the father's voice play overhead. And the father or the mother will not be talking directly to the infant. It might just be like a side conversation that they would have with a friend in the kitchen or a family member. So they're not talking to the infant, but the voice of the parent will be recognizable to the infant. And then once they hear one of the voices, we'll test their heart rate again. So then I want to have the parent's voice play, but the infant-directed speech directly to the child. Like an example would be like, "Hi, sweetie, it's okay. This person is going to play with you." Just like talking directly to the infant. And then testing, and again, that's either the mother's or the father's voice, depending on which group they're assigned into. And then we're going to test the heart rate again. Also, during this whole experiment, we're going to be recording if there is any signs of distress. So like if the stranger walked in the room and then the infant automatically started crying, we would take a note of that. If they didn't start crying until one of the parents started talking infant-directed speech to them, that's something else to record. So the main purpose of the study is going to be, if you're in the group where you just hear the mother's voice, if their heart rate will become lower when they hear the mother's voice compared to the groups that hear the father's voice. And also something that we could work on in the study is, instead of having maybe the second round of the recording be infant-directed speech, it could almost be yelling at the stranger too. Hey, like, stop, get away, something like that. Something that sounds like protecting, to see if that is comforting to the baby as well. So I do feel like we could do either multiple tests like that or kind of see. But the main purpose is I want to see if the infant's heart rate, my hypothesis is going to be, if an infant is in the group where they hear the dad's voice ahead, I think that their heart rate is going to be lower and they're going to feel calmer and show less distress, because the father's voice is evolutionary known to be the protector of the children. So if they hear their father's voice, that will be better than hearing their mother's voice. So that is what the purpose of the experiment is. It's about speech of the mothers and the fathers, to see if a baby is in a stressful situation, such as a strained situation. Experiment if they will have a preference to the fathers versus the mothers, because in prior research we have had just preference to the mothers. So I think that this will be a very interesting experiment. And something on how I think that, depending on what the results could be, will affect future research is then we can look into more gender roles for emotional regulation. So more if it matters if it was a son responding to the strange situation versus a daughter, I think could be very interesting, just like the differences on how they handle that. Also, does sex of the baby and sex of the parent have an influence? So if it happened to be a son hearing the father's voice, would that be different than a daughter hearing the father's voice? I think that could be interesting. And then lastly, how does this sense of trust with a parent influence trust with others in their lives, such as teachers? So maybe if they do hear that father's voice, that will be more calming to them. And then maybe in the future, they'll have a male teacher and there will be some kind of a different trust relationship that they have with them versus a female teacher. I would just be interested to find out more about this topic, and I do think that this is interesting just because of the history that gender roles have and how so much has changed over the last few centuries. With moms no longer being stay-at-home and they're entering the workforce, and dads being stay-at-home dads, when traditionally women were always the one who cared for children and comforted children, while fathers, would go hunt and then also protect if there was some kind of an enemy invading. So I just want to see kind of if this is still innate to children or just how this has affected current day and age. So thank you so much, and I'm excited to look into this topic more.